Welcome to Silent Screams, where darkness, whispers, and terror await you. Are you ready to confront your fears? Story 1: The Shadows of Evermore House. It all begins with a mysterious invitation. Mark, a young man who's just moved to the city, receives an envelope with no return address. Inside is a handwritten note: "The shadows are calling. Come find the truth." The message is cryptic, but it's the postmark on the envelope, a forgotten town named Evermore, that sparks his curiosity. It's a place he's never heard of, tucked far away in the hills. And despite warnings from his friends, Mark decides to visit. He has no idea that stepping foot in Evermore will plunge him into a nightmare beyond his control. Mark arrives in Evermore, greeted by an eerie fog that lingers over the dilapidated town. The streets are empty, the buildings decaying, as though time itself has forgotten this place. At the heart of the town stands the Evermore House, a massive mansion known for its dark history, stories of tragic deaths and bizarre disappearances. Mark, feeling an unsettling pull, walks up to the house. And to his shock, the front door creaks open as though someone is expecting him. Once inside, the atmosphere is suffocating: dusty chandeliers, cobwebbed corners, and the constant feeling of being watched. He's not alone. In the halls, he hears whispers, soft yet deliberate, calling his name. The house seems alive, and as Mark explores, he discovers old family portraits with eyes that follow his every move. As Mark ventures deeper into the house, he begins to uncover unsettling details: a diary left behind by a woman named Eleanor, whose family vanished under mysterious circumstances decades ago. The more Mark reads, the more he starts to hear voices, at first faint, then growing louder, until they're no longer whispers but screams. The walls seem to pulse with the same rhythm as his heartbeat. Eleanor's journal speaks of a cult that had worshipped something dark and ancient, a presence that lurked in the house's very foundation. Mark becomes obsessed. The whispers now lead him to a hidden door in the basement. When he opens it, he finds a room, sealed for years, covered in strange symbols and writings that he cannot decipher. His presence disturbs something in the house, and the atmosphere turns violent. The shadows seem to move of their own accord, and figures appear in the corners of his vision, always just out of reach. As Mark begins to unravel the history of the house and the cult, he learns that Eleanor wasn't the first to go mad. Many before her had entered the house and never left. They were consumed by the spirits of the house, the very ones who had made the deal with the dark entity that now haunts it. Eleanor's descent into madness was triggered by her discovery of the entity, a being beyond comprehension, its presence drawing her in like a moth to a flame. In his desperation, Mark attempts to leave, but the house has other plans. The walls close in, the windows shatter in bursts of blood-red light, and the floor beneath him begins to crack open, revealing a vast chasm of blackness. The shadows in the corners come to life, taking form, shifting shapes of twisted faces and decayed limbs. As Mark tries to flee, he's pursued by the very thing he's been searching for, the entity itself. Its cold voice now booming in his mind, demanding to be freed. Mark reaches the attic, where Eleanor had tried to destroy the entity. Here, the air is thick with oppressive energy. The entity reveals itself to Mark, its form incomprehensible, a shadowy amalgamation of limbs, eyes, and teeth. It speaks of an ancient curse, one that has been passed down through generations, consuming all who dare to enter. It offers Mark a choice: join it, become part of its eternal hunger, or die. His soul trapped forever in the walls of Evermore house. In a desperate attempt to escape, Mark uses the ritual from Eleanor's journal, hoping to reverse the curse. The house trembles. The shadows scream. And for a moment, Mark believes he has succeeded. But just as he reaches the front door, the entity laughs. He's not escaping. Evermore house is a prison for the souls of the lost. And Mark, now marked by the entity, is its latest inhabitant. As the story concludes, we flash back to the present day. The house still stands, waiting for its next visitor. The camera lingers on an old photograph of Mark, now trapped in the walls, his face forever etched in the portraits that line the halls. A chilling whisper echoes through the empty house, "Welcome home, Mark." The camera pans out, revealing that the shadows have taken over the town of Evermore, waiting for someone else to walk into their deadly embrace. Story 2, The Hollow Echoes. It was a night like no other in the small town of Wyndham Hollow. The heavy fog that had rolled in from the mountains cloaked everything, transforming the streets into shadowy pathways. With the old, abandoned houses standing eerily still under the pale moonlight. The townspeople had always spoken in hushed tones about the village's history, as if afraid to utter the full truth. The wind carried the faintest whispers, too quiet to decipher but too haunting to ignore. They claimed the sound came from the hollow, a dark forest that bordered the town, a place everyone knew to avoid after sunset. For years, rumors had swirled about the forest. Tales of strange sightings and eerie figures glimpsed through the trees. But it wasn't just the forest that had the townspeople on edge. It was the house. The one that had stood abandoned for decades at the edge of the hollow. A decaying mansion whose windows were always dark, whose doors were always shut. Yet, at night, strange lights flickered within its walls. And some claimed to hear sounds coming from inside, footsteps, faint voices, and a distant, hollow echo. Hannah, a curious and brave soul from the town, had always been skeptical of the stories. She had heard them all her life, dismissed them as just that, stories. But one night, after the whispers had reached a fever pitch, she made a decision that would change everything. She would visit the mansion herself and uncover the truth. The path through the hollow was more treacherous than Hannah had imagined. The mist was thick, and the trees seemed to press closer, their twisted branches reaching for her like skeletal fingers. She didn't turn back, though. The house was just ahead, its silhouette now more defined through the fog. As she reached the front gates, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over her. Something was wrong, but she was too far in to turn back. When she approached the mansion's front door, it creaked open as if beckoning her in. Her breath hitched. She stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind her. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the scent of decay was unbearable. As she walked through the grand hall, the silence was deafening. The only sound was her heartbeat, quickening with each step. It wasn't until she reached the staircase that she heard it, a soft, muffled voice coming from above. She froze. It was faint, but unmistakable. Someone was whispering, desperately trying to stay calm. She ascended the stairs, each creak of the wood echoing in the stillness. The voice grew clearer, a low murmur that seemed to come from just around the corner. Hannah's hand trembled as she reached for the door at the end of the hallway. The moment she touched the handle, it swung open by itself. Inside the room was a large, old mirror, Her reflection stared back at her. But something was off. There was a shadow moving behind her. Just out of view. Panic surged in her chest. She spun around. But the room was empty. And then she saw it. A faint outline in the mirror, a figure. Pale and translucent. Standing just behind her. Its face was blurred. Like a smudged painting. But the eyes were wide open. Staring directly at her. Frozen in place. She tried to scream. But no sound came. The figure began to move. Slowly reaching out. Its fingers elongated and twisted. Her heart pounded in her chest as she backed away. But the figure continued to follow her in the reflection. Its presence growing stronger. It wasn't until the figure's hand reached through the mirror, brushing her cheek, that she finally found her voice. Hannah ran. Not looking back. Not stopping until she was outside the mansion. The fog had thickened. And the once familiar town of Wyndham Hollow now felt like a distant memory. The house had an unnatural glow about it. The windows flickering as if alive. She could hear the whispers again, this time. They were louder. More frantic. As if the house itself was calling her back. Desperately. She tried to escape. But no matter how far she ran, the house seemed to follow her. As the night grew darker, the whispers became clearer. And Hannah realized the truth: the house never let its visitors go. The figures in the mansion, the voices, the cold touch, were all part of an ancient curse that had bound the souls of the town to the hollow. The mansion was a prison, and she had just become its latest inhabitant. Days later, the townspeople spoke in hushed whispers of Hannah's disappearance. No one had seen her since that night. But some claimed to have heard her voice on the wind, calling from the hollow, urging others to come find her. And some, late at night, claimed they saw a figure standing in the window of the mansion, its face pale, its eyes wide open, staring blankly out at the town. Story 3: The Whispering Walls of Ashford Manor. Clara had never been a fan of old houses. The creaking floors, the shadows that seemed to move on their own, everything about them felt wrong. But Ashford Manor, with its towering walls and sprawling gardens, was different. When Clara received the letter informing her of her inheritance, she never expected it would lead her to this ancient relic of a forgotten past. Her uncle, the last known owner of the manor, had been a quiet, solitary man, living in his reclusive world without so much as a visitor. He had left her the house with no explanation. Only a note that read, "Protect the secrets." From the moment Clara crossed the wrought iron gates of Ashford Manor, something felt off. The mansion loomed above her like a beast, its windows dark, as if watching her approach. Yet she brushed off the feeling as she stepped inside. The house, though dusty and cold, was beautiful in its decay, with intricate woodwork and forgotten tapestries adorning the walls. Her family, her younger brother Ben and their parents, had come along to help settle in. As they unpacked, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive. At night, she heard the softest whispers, like a faint murmur of voices from the walls. She tried to tell herself it was just the wind, but it felt too real. The whispers grew louder as the days passed. One night, Clara was alone in the library, sorting through some old books left behind by her uncle. That's when she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. She froze, listening closely. No one else was in the house. She grabbed a nearby candle and made her way toward the stairs. her heart racing in her chest. The floorboards creaked under her weight. But it wasn't her own movements she could hear, it was something else. Suddenly, Ben appeared in the hallway. His face pale. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Clara nodded. Her throat dry. "What is it?" "I don't know," Ben said. His voice shaky. But it came from the walls. They ventured deeper into the manor, searching for the source of the sound. But found nothing. Still, Clara couldn't escape the gnawing sense that something, or someone, was watching them. It wasn't just the house, it was the very air around them, heavy with a malevolent energy. Later that evening, Clara found a strange, leather-bound diary tucked away on a high shelf in the library. It was old, with yellowing pages and a scent of decay. As she flipped through its pages, she discovered it was written by one of the original inhabitants of Ashford Manor, a man named Elias Ashford. His words were filled with cryptic warnings about the house, its foundation built upon an ancient burial ground, and the spirits that had been trapped within its walls. "I hear their whispers," Elias had written in a frantic scrawl. "They tell me things no one should know. They hunger. I fear they will consume me." Clara shuddered, closing the diary with trembling hands. She tried to dismiss it as the ramblings of a madman, but something about it felt all too real. Over the next few days, the paranormal activity escalated. Clara's parents began to experience strange phenomena. Objects moved on their own. Lights flickered without reason. And the temperature in the house plummeted, even on the warmest of days. But the worst was the feeling of being watched, always accompanied by the low whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. One night, Ben disappeared. Clara woke up to find her brother's bed empty, his blankets twisted in a way that made her stomach turn. She called out for him, but her voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. Her parents searched the house in a panic, but there was no sign of Ben, no trace at all. In the library, Clara found the diary again, her eyes scanning its pages in desperation. She noticed a passage she had missed before, written in hurried, desperate handwriting. "The walls are alive. They are not just watching, they are feeding. The spirits are inside, and they crave the living." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She knew now that the entity in the house was not just a ghost, it was something far more sinister. A malevolent force that had been feeding on the souls of the manor's inhabitants for centuries. And now, it had set its sights on her family, determined to save her brother. Clara ventured deeper into the manor, drawn to a part of the house she had never noticed before. In the cellar, hidden behind a wall of stacked crates, she found a trapdoor leading into an underground chamber. The air in the room was thick and stale, the walls damp with age. As she descended into the darkness, Clara's heart pounded in her chest. The chamber was small, barely large enough to hold a single person. But there, in the center of the room, was a strange altar. The walls surrounding it were lined with strange symbols, symbols that seemed to shift and move, as if they were alive. At the center of the altar, Clara saw something that made her blood run cold, the skeletal remains of the original Ashford family, still dressed in their fine clothes, their faces frozen in expressions of horror. Clara knelt by the altar, examining the remains. As she did, the walls began to hum, a low vibration that seemed to resonate deep within her bones. She could hear the whispers now, clear and loud, echoing through the chamber. They were all around her, speaking in unison. "She's here. She's come to free us. The walls hunger for her soul. Suddenly, the altar began to glow with a sickly green light. And Clara felt a cold, clammy hand grip her ankle. She screamed, her voice echoing through the chamber. But no one could hear her. The walls closed in, pressing against her as if the house itself was alive, suffocating her. But then, Clara remembered the diary. She quickly rifled through its pages, desperately searching for a way to banish the spirit. She found the answer in the final entry. To free the souls trapped within, one must sacrifice the bloodline. Only then will the walls release their grip. Clara's heart sank. The entity had known all along. It had been waiting for her to come to the house, to fulfill its dark prophecy. She had no choice now, she had to confront it. The moment Clara spoke the incantation aloud, the ground trembled, and the air grew thick with energy. The walls of Ashford Manor groaned and shifted, as if the house itself was alive. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow, stretching toward her. In the center of the room, the entity appeared, a dark, twisted figure, its form flickering like a dying flame. Its eyes were hollow, filled with an insatiable hunger. It whispered Clara's name, its voice a low, guttural rasp. "You have freed us, but at what cost?" it hissed. Clara fought with everything she had left, pushing the entity back with the power of the incantation. The air around her crackled with energy, and the walls seemed to resist. But Clara's will was stronger. In the final moments, Clara's vision blurred. The entity let out one last, blood-curdling scream as it was pulled back into the walls, its form dissolving into the darkness. The house fell silent. Clara and her parents left Ashford Manor that night, never to return. Ben was never found, and the house was abandoned, left to decay once more. But as Clara looked back, she swore she saw something in the window, an outline of a figure, standing in the dark, watching her. The whispers never truly stopped.